All right, well, thank you for coming. And I have driven down from the Northeast Kingdom because I am writing this book about the roads of southwestern Vermont. People up there don't know what I'm talking about. So I thought I would come down here where people hopefully did. The reason I'm writing this book is because when I wrote my previous book, which was called We People in Vermont, it came out in 2019, and it is by and large a book about a town called Landgrove. People know Landgrove at all? Okay. They really don't want you to know that it's there, but it's a really interesting story. I realized in the process of writing that book, I was barely halfway through, when I realized that what Vermont really needed was a book about the construction and impact of the interstate highways. And I've always known that this was the important thing. I mean, in another lifetime, 25 years ago, when I was teaching Vermont history at UVM, I always called the last section of the course the interstate era. I mean, really, Vermont in the 20th century is a before and after story, before the interstates and after the interstates. So I knew that this was, and there's no book on that topic, and so I really knew it needed to get written. And so then I began researching it, and I needed to figure out what was the highway department, and how did its budget work, and how did its districts work, and who were the commissioners over the years, and what were the big controversies. And in the process of doing that research, it became clear to me quickly that the most interesting story wasn't the highways that got built, it was the highway that didn't get built. Not where the highways were, but where the highway wasn't. And that is to say, Bennington and Rutland counties. And it's very clear to me. And it became clear to me quickly that this was a sequel to my last book, really fundamentally, and explored a lot of the same issues just in a later period of time. And in order to just set this up, just from the beginning, I want you to know that I take very seriously this idea that Vermont is a place that is trying to perfect balance. I mean, when it was founded, it promised people that it would perfect the balance between freedom and unity, between the needs of the individual who want to be self-fulfilled and your desire for other people to restrain their behavior so that you can have a fulfilling community life. And ever since then, Vermont has been on this journey to try to prove that it can reconcile the most fundamental contradictions of the human experience. It's a journey, there's no destination, but we are on our way doing that. And the next thing that was most important that came to Vermont to move forward is when the railroads came in. And the railroads had this really profound demographic impact on Vermont. What happened was that before that, basically the population had been generally spread out across the state, occupation, socioeconomically speaking. When the railroads came in, what it did was it concentrated commerce in the towns that had depots. And so a lot of small towns that the railroads bypassed that didn't have depots, the professionals, particularly the children of the professionals, the doctors, the lawyers, the businessmen, they fled because there was no reason for them to be there anymore. And small towns became much more homogenous, much more consensus-driven, much more rural, really, in their own way. Among these railroads, of course, was the Rutland Railroad, which was the vital artery and turned Rutland in the 19th century into a thriving economic center. And it's a thing about back then is that Rutland was what was right about Vermont. And for the state's leaders, for the educated, the professionals, the businessmen and politicians, Rutland was an example of what was good about Vermont. And small towns that you would follow as you took the rails of the Rutland out to a place, for instance, here like Dorset, was what was wrong with Vermont. Because the problem with these small towns was the most energetic and intelligent people had left them and had left behind the ne'er-do-wells, the people who married their cousins, the people who had no ambition, the people who lacked the energy to do things. The general consensus was that rural Vermont was in decline, the consensus on the part of people in the big cities. If you ask the people in the small towns, are you in decline? They'd say, absolutely not. This is great. We live in a beautiful place surrounded by all our relatives. They saw it as being that they were stable. And so this is the sort of polarity of Gilded Age Vermont, which is the dynamic between the people who thought rural Vermont was in decline versus the people who thought that it was perfectly stable. This slide shows there was all sorts of people talking about what are the remedies to the decline, the stagnation of rural Vermont. This one says that the solution may be we should attract people from cities who are worn out from the hustle and bustle and pollution of city life. But that never, this is from 1871, that ever actually happened to any significant extent. This is what my last book was about, another solution to the decline of rural Vermont, I put that in quotations, was to attract Swedes because they were Protestants and had blonde hair, and they were tall and had straight teeth and didn't form unions. And they were better than French Canadians, and that was the plan. Obviously that plan, to a great extent, of course, didn't work out either. But what it did do, the key to this passage here is, it says that the agitation, that Major Valentine, who ran this program to attract Swedes, his program was like a sacrifice hit in baseball, because what it did is it drew attention all around the country, because it was like news of the weird, that Vermont was attracting Swedes to its abandoned farms, that Vermont farms could be had really cheap. And having a summer home, a vacation home, had been something for elites, for people who had houses in Newport or wherever, up until really the 1890s. And this program that was run in Vermont really drew attention that you could have you could buy a house, abandoned farm in Vermont really, really cheap. And it was within the price range of a middle-class family. Of course, the big question was how to get there. And the answer, of course, at that point was railroads. So that really confined the second home market to specific places where the railroads went, like along where the Rutland Railroad was. The process of doing the Swede program in 1890 led this fellow, who was Alonzo Valentine, who was from Bennington, to compile the first comprehensive list of farms for sale in Vermont and to set up a network of people in towns around Vermont where he could send these thousands and thousands of letters he was receiving from people inquiring about acquiring these farms that were really cheap as summer homes. And when the program for Swedes ended, they gave that list to the Vermont Board of Agriculture because no one else knew what to do with it. And so weirdly, the Board of Agriculture from 1891 to 1910 was the body that promoted tourism and the sale of second homes in Vermont. It doesn't really make any sense, but it's Vermont, and what are you going to do? They advertised Vermont, the Board of Agriculture did, but mainly it was well-to-do middle-class people. This is the golf course in Bennington. Obviously, in 1886, the Dorset Field Club started, and soon after that, the Equinox Golf Club down the road here was founded. And that was sort of like the attention to people that they wanted to attract. In 1910, because the Board of Agriculture was reorganized, but also it made no sense that the Board of Agriculture was promoting tourism. So what happened was the state created something called the Publicity Bureau, which was the first body of its kind in any state in the country that was solely devoted to promoting tourism. What they did was they published pamphlets, road maps. You could write into the Bureau of Publicity, which is located in the Secretary of State's office, and they would send you free pamphlets telling you how you could, and lists of farms for sale. And this was the way that they went about attracting attention in Vermont to filling up their pamphlets and mailings. At the same time, this is around 1910, 1911, roads were starting to become a bigger and bigger issue in Vermont as cars moved slowly from being complete luxury items to being something that middle-class families could begin to afford, and that tourists began to use in order to come up either for a weekend or a week or to have access to their summer home. And trust me, the roads in Vermont, universally at that point, were just terrible roads. They were universally decried as being horrible, so we had things like the Good Roads movement. This is nicely illustrated by this thing called the Ideal Tour, which started in 1911, and it was a group of hotel owners in New England who had a tour that you could take that went in a loop around Vermont, or around New England, and took you from hotel to hotel to hotel. The Equinox Hotel was on that tour, and then from there you would go to the east through a place called Peru Pass. And Peru Pass was like the worst nightmarish place on the whole Ideal Tour. I mean, for basically the whole year. One of the things they had to do was get horses that would be up there on Peru Pass, and they would have to drag cars over the top of Peru Pass. I mean, really, it was becoming clear that if Vermont was going to take advantage of tourism as well as it possibly could, it really needed to do something about its roads. This is sort of like the period in between, the sort of like twilight period, where you can see at the top the Rutland Railroad is advertising, because a lot of the Rutland Railroad's business was based on summer tourists. And then below it, there's the automobile tourism. And you begin to see by this point, the 19-teens, that cars, automobiles, and not railroads are going to be the future of tourism. So all of this. One thing that really, if you look at this picture, the way that the Bureau of Publicity sold Vermont in the 1920s was as a beautiful landscape. They were not selling the human landscape, the people there, the communities, the way of life, by any means. What they were selling was the beauty of the scenery. It was Vermont was America's Switzerland. You could drive on what they always called their cushiony gravel roads. And I don't know why they call them cushiony gravel roads, but that was the case. But you can see it is a very elite crowd there at the bottom of that picture. There was complete indifference to the native Vermonter as far as they were concerned. That wasn't part of the sell. By the 1920s, there were some misgivings among some people about the extent to which Vermont was turning its attention towards tourism as the economic salvation for the state. The 19th century Vermont economy was basically based on 3 pillars, which was dairy farms, which reached their peak in the census of 1880. Extractive industries like lumber and quarrying, which were already in decline by the 1890s, and small manufacturing concerns. And Vermont wages were too high compared to South Carolina. So all 3 of these pillars of the 19th century economy were on their way out. And the question was what we were going to replace them with. And increasingly, recreation and tourism seemed to be the answer. A woman from Dorset, who was a writer though, she said, is this really going to be a good idea? Do we really want to prostrate ourselves at the feet of outsiders? Is that really a smart future for the state of Vermont? And this is what she said, will it work out? And this is from 1924. But still the state pressed ahead. And one of the amazing things about tourism in this era is that the state government officials, like the person who ran the Publicity Bureau in the late 1920s, Walter Crockett, was completely just so callous about these things. He would do these studies and he would say, it's so wonderful because we did a study and 20 years ago there were 6 farms for sale in these 5 towns, but now there's 40 farms for sale so that outsiders can buy them and use them as second homes. Isn't that wonderful? And the answer is, well, it's not really wonderful if you're the farm family that wanted to hand that farm down to your kids, if you're the kids who wanted to inherit the farm. It's not so great, but clearly the dairy farms were in decline, and the state was very indifferent to persistence in the human landscape at that point. So the problem with roads was a big issue, obviously, at this point, and it was in 1930 that these great parades happened. Route 7 was dedicated as the Ethan Allen Highway in 1930. The state had a policy through their highway department that what they did was they fixed up the roads in the southern part of the state first, and then turned their attention to the northern part of the state. And for 1930s traffic, for 1930 truck sizes, Route 7 was perfectly fine. It was a road that was 16 to 18 feet wide in most spots. The trucks were really small at that point. People didn't drive as quickly as they drove 20 years later, and it seemed like a perfectly adequate road for the traffic of 1930. But they really didn't look ahead, or they didn't know what was coming. Because quickly, as the 1930s rolled along, people began to be like, you know, Route 7 is a really terrible road. It really actually needs to be widened and fixed up. But at that point, the attention was on the northern counties of the state as far as the highway department was concerned, and nothing got done. So but it was widely recognized, of course, that if Vermont was going to depend so heavily on tourism, that the main arteries in the state needed to be better roads. And this was particularly true of Route 7. Route 7 had a lot more traffic on it than Route 5. And still, Route 5 was considered a much better road. And in 1935, a new body, which was the Vermont State Planning Board, published something called the Graphic Survey. And what you can see there is that they say that 2/3 of the way down, dairy farming is on the way out, manufacturing is on the way out, extractive industry is on the way out. There's only one industry in Vermont that has the potential for unlimited growth, and that's tourism. And we're going to put our eggs in that basket. Tourism is going to be the most important industry that's going to propel the state's economy in the future. It's going to be the crutch we're going to have to depend on. So this is the advertisements they had at the time. The advertisement, the slogan that Vermont had in the 1930s was that Vermont was unspoiled. It was the unspoiled state, the unspoiled land. Now, if you're work in the quarries in Barrie, or if you work in the woolen mill in Winooski, or even on a dairy farm, you might not really consider Vermont to be unspoiled. It was very much an image. It wasn't by any means true, but nevertheless, that was what Vermont's leaders aspired the state to emulate, to most closely resemble. And it was at this point, like in my last book, that this fellow named Sam Ogden moved to Landgrove. He bought up all the houses in the village and sold them off to his friends and created this oasis as a summer colony. As more and more towns became like this, there's no railroad that runs through Landgrove. Thank God they didn't want one. And so the only way you can access these places is through cars. And automobiles are progressively becoming more and more and more important to the state's recreation industry, keeping Vermont unspoiled. Ogden was just one of this generation of people in southwestern Vermont for whom this idea of Vermont as meaning more than a beautiful landscape, but also as a way of life was becoming centrally important. Dorothy Canfield Fisher of Arlington, and Dres Norton, who owned the Vermont Country Store in Weston, and Walter Hard of Manchester here, were some of the people, really central figures, in saying that it's not just about a beautiful scenery, it's about a way of life. It's a holistic. It's not just about the scenery, it's about the people who live in the community, the good old crusty, honest, stubborn Vermonters, and town meeting, and all of it is dependent on it remaining on a small scale. If you want tools and don't have them, you start your own forge. If you want good schools, you get engaged in the school board. If you want good politics, you go to the state legislature, which in a town like Landgrove, which had 30 voters, wasn't really very hard. But it has to remain on a small scale. That is the key to the Vermont way of life. And so it's that point, when you get to the World War II years, that the federal government had really decided that what it was going to do was going to come up with this national network of interstate quality roads. The Pennsylvania Turnpike was built in the 1930s. That was really sort of a model for them. And Eisenhower had been and seen the Autobahn in Germany and really was enormously impressed by it. So this was in 1944, they drew up the first plan for what the interstate highways would look like. This was the original plan, was just essentially 91 was going to go up and 89 was going to have a terminus in White River Junction. But the owner of the Burlington Daily News newspaper, whose name was William Loeb, he went on to be a firebrand who owned the newspaper in Manchester, New Hampshire. He owned the Burlington Daily News, and he wanted Burlington to be on the Interstate Highway Network. So he drew up a bunch of maps like this one for what the highway should look like. You might know this, but Vermont has more miles of interstate highway per capita than any other American state. It does. We have a ridiculously huge amount of highways that we really don't need. The Northeast Kingdom is a really good example, as you were saying. This is actually ridiculously much more highways than we ever could have needed. And so this idea, but the plan as you go through the mid-1940s was that Burlington and southwestern Vermont were going to be left out of the interstate highway plan. People down here in southwestern Vermont didn't seem all that concerned about it. There wasn't a lot of talk about it being important, although Burlington people were really concerned about it. At that same time, people like Sam Ogden there are becoming increasingly conscious that Vermont's economy is dependent on the integrity of its environment. The conservation impulse in Vermont grew stronger and stronger because of the fear that too much development will destroy the very thing that tourists come looking for. We need clean streams, we need better forests, and only certain industries are consistent with the Vermont way of life. Factories, bad. Industries that don't smoke, bad. Things like skiing. Now that is an industry that has a very low impact on the environment, or so they thought, and that attracts the right kind of people, which is well-to-do people, and is consistent with the preservation of the scenery and the environment, and also the way of life in communities that constitutes the Vermont way of life that was broadcast through Vermont Life magazine, which was founded in 1946, and which told Vermont is very strongly as being a particular way of life. So in 1947, the federal government, William Loeb supposedly was friends with the chief McDonough, who ran the Bureau of Public Roads, and he persuaded him to build what was called the Loeb Loop, And the low loop is 89 from White River Junction up to Burlington. And people in Burlington celebrated, and still people in southwestern Vermont, on the most part, didn't seem too concerned about this. Although they were concerned about the quality of Route 7, which year after year, when the state still devoted no attention to it, grew worse and worse and worse, even as it had more and more traffic, and particularly heavy truck traffic and tourism traffic. And the concern was that people, once you drive on Route 7 once, you're never going to want to come back. You're going to go on Route 5 or on Route 9 over in New York State. You're not going to use that road. This is a motorcade they took to New York City in order to sell Route 7. It didn't make any difference at all. Tourists would say, that road is terrible, it's so dangerous. And this is tourists won't be fooled on the route more than once. If they come into the state on Route 7 last year, they'll try Route 5 next year. I mean, this was really being recognized increasingly as being this absolutely existential problem for southwestern Vermont's economy by, this is 1951. And how dangerous is Route 7? I mean, I've spent a lot of time reading newspapers back then, and it does seem like the carnage on the road. And I would point out Death Valley in Arlington was a really dangerous spot, and Westerman's Curve in Manchester was notoriously a blind curve on an 18-foot wide, 2-lane road in a snowstorm is a really, really bad idea. And just people here recognize that something needed to be done, even as Vermont's being sold as this paradise, this gorgeous place. It's not just a state, it's a contented state of mind. And Robert Frost says, you'll love Vermont too, and all of that. Even as the state's economy was really dramatically changing. In 1945, there were about 24,000 farms in Vermont. By the early 1960s, it had gone down below 10,000. It was like 9,400 in 1964. You're talking about the displacement of something between 120 and 150,000 people because of bulk tanks, generally changes in the economy. Small dairy farms increasingly didn't make any sense in Vermont. And so and when your dairy farm goes out of business, as so many did in those years between the end of World War II and the 1960s, where do you go? If you're a working class person, you go to one of the population centers. You go to Rutland, you go to Bennington, White River Junction, Barry, wherever, where the jobs are. So, but going to Rutland wasn't necessarily a great option in the post-World War II years. The Vermont Marble Company, which is one of the 2 pillars of the economy of Rutland, was in terrible shape, was laying people off, fewer and fewer orders, and particularly the failure of the Rutland Railroad, which went bankrupt repeatedly, which had a number of strikes, and in 1953 abandoned passenger service. I mean, that felt like a real blow to Rutland, the working class town up there. And so people were like, what is the future of Rutland? There were questions being asked, like this article, about what's the matter with Rutland? Rutland is broken. Rutland is a terrible place. And it has no future at all. People in Rutland were really hurt by that. It was, but to an extent they saw the reality of it. I mean, what was Rutland's future? 2 people I'd like to point out at that point, which is the early 1950s, really started to make a big push to revive Rutland's fortunes. One of them was the owner and publisher of the Rutland Herald, whose name was Bob Mitchell. And the other one was the president of the Rutland Chamber of Commerce, whose name was Roland Seward. And Roland Seward owned a dairy farm in Wallingford and the dairy bar. Everybody knows about Roland Seward. But we're not done with Roland yet. It became, for Bob Mitchell in the Rutland Herald, this absolute obsession. I mean, issue after issue after issue after issue has an editorial saying that something needs to be done about Route 7. Rutland, the whole region is going to die if we don't improve Route 7. And that western Vermont is doomed to an economic death if we don't revitalize Route 7 as quickly as possible. And that it's very dangerous, and that the tourist travel, no one's going to drive on Route 7. And if the tourist traffic dries up, it's bad enough already. Rutland will have nothing left. This whole region, Bennington and all the towns in between, are going to suffer economic doom if that happens. So these are examples of, anyway. So in 1956, of course, the Federal Aid Highway Act passed that placed the interstate highways essentially in Vermont, exactly where they are now. And there was a lot of discussion about how the highways were going to be the economic salvation of Vermont. I mean, extent to which people estimated the impact of the highways in Vermont is really quite remarkable. But it was something that they wanted. It was for the people who were like, this is going to be great. It's going to cause this huge boom in Vermont. It's going to be amazing for the economy. You should see the Northeast Kingdom. Watch out, Newport, here comes Barton. I mean, they're really people talking about like this Wizard of Oz future about how the highways were going to dramatically redirect the state's fortunes. And it's going to double the state population, which people thought at the time sounded great, and it's going to bring new industries, and it's going to revitalize the state comprehensively. And it's really at this point, people in southwestern Vermont began to realize that the fact that they were left off the interstate highways was a huge crisis. This was a really big problem. If the highways were going to have this huge impact wherever they went, and they don't come here, with all the other things that are mounting up against southwestern Vermont, this is going to be a death blow to this region of the state. Something needs to be done about Route 7. So, in 1956, when the Interstate Highway bill passed, the Rutland Chamber of Commerce decided something needed to be done. And what they did was they began to lobby to have the highway redirected up to the center of the state. Essentially, it was their plan was for it to go west from Bellows Falls and go up basically on the line of Route 103 through Chester and Ludlow, and then up into Rutland. And their reasoning was, we're going to have to pay 10% of the cost of this, which is a huge expense for Vermont. But it's basically a highway that serves New Hampshire just as much as it serves us. 91 is basically New Hampshire's highway as much as it's Vermont's highway, but New Hampshire doesn't have to pay for it. It should go up to the center of the state, particularly when southwestern Vermont is more than a quarter of the state's population. How come that whole part is bypassed? And so, of course, people along the Connecticut River Valley were absolutely upset about how there was this big legislative push to move the highway, and there was regional rivalries going on. And I'll add, the reason they put the highway, of course, in the Connecticut River Valley is, number one, it's a much flatter, broad river plain. And also because the federal government wanted to go through Hartford and Springfield, Massachusetts. So it made perfect sense to put it there. But why can't you then turn it to the west and send it up to the center of the state? The State Highway Board completely rejected the idea of moving the highway, and when that plan fell through, mostly through the Rutland Chamber of Commerce, they formed this thing called the Regional Highway Council. Roland Seward was at the center of this, and the Regional Highway Council took it upon itself to lobby for better highways for southwestern Vermont, particularly the improvement of Route 7 and also Route 4 going west to the New York state line. There's our friend Roland Seward, and at a banquet of the Chamber of Commerce and the Regional Highway Council. And they projected, that something, if you weren't going to fix up the highway in Rutland County, if you weren't going to relocate the highway to the center of the state, well, then you had to fix Route 7. Route 7 was growing manifestly more dangerous on an ongoing basis. And here's at a Democratic rally in 1956, a person says, we don't necessarily want a 4-lane Route 7, but the Route 7 we have is forlorn, and things absolutely need to improve. A winding, as you can see there on the bottom of that, Route 7, and this is a very typical description of Route 7 at the time. It's winding, poorly maintained, and hazardous. So, in order to fund the interstate highways, Vermont had to cast off the tradition of being a pay-as-you-go state. Like, Vermont had never issued bonds before, but they could no way could afford the 10% of the federal highway the highway cost that it was responsible for. So it came up for a vote in 1957 whether Vermont would abandon pay-as-you-go and issue bonds. And if it hadn't been for the votes of legislators from Bennington and Rutland counties in favor of it, it never would have passed. It wouldn't have passed then. And in return for that, as you can see, Governor Johnson promised southwestern Vermont roads comparable to interstate standards. You want to ask, please?
It wasn't after the flood of 1927, wasn't there bonds issued for rebuilding the roads that had been taken out?
Well, what happened was actually the state received a federal grant of like $2.3 million. So the state said, and then tried to pretend that it didn't, because it was a little embarrassed out. But actually, Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce at the time, led the charge to have Vermont receive, it was like $2.3 million in federal aid. Yeah. So Route 7, So a harbinger of things to come, by the way, is in 1957, the most powerful person in the state of Vermont in many ways was a guy named Hubert Sargent, who was the highway commissioner. Governors came and went, but the highway commissioner stayed. And he controlled a budget that was 2/3 the size of the general fund. The highway department controlled its own budget, and that was 2/3 as big as the budget for everything else. And he basically did whatever he wanted to. And do you know where Granville Gulf is? Up to Granville. So that road was terrible and incredibly dangerous. And so he said, we'll build you a better road, we'll straighten it and widen it. But the head of the Department of Parks and Forests, whose name was Perry Merrill, said that that would be too environmentally destructive. So a battle began between the Highway Department and the Conservation Department in the state that eventually got sorted out as a compromise, and they sort of improved Granville Gulf, not as much as they would have, but it was a compromise. Generally speaking, though, this is where conservationists and highways begin to be butt heads, begin to not cooperate with each other. If you can't put a nice highway, two-lane highway, through Granville Gulf, are you really going to be able to build a highway of comparable to interstate standards up through the Battenkill River Valley? Well, we will see. So southern Vermont, southwestern Vermonters are watching while the rest of the state gets these much nicer highways, looking on in jealousy, and meanwhile they have to deal with roads like that on an ongoing basis. It just doesn't seem fair. Our tax money is going to pay for highways that people in New Hampshire use more than we use. It is just not fair, and our roads are terrible. So in 1961 they tried again, and this was the plan that they had, was the Regional Highway Council, which wasn't just based in Rutland, but that's where its headquarters were, was they said it's not too late. The highway only did not yet reach Bellows Falls. We need to turn the highway to the west and send it to the center of the state. And in 1961, this became a hugely controversial issue. It really dominated the legislative session that year. The state highway board said it wasn't practical. People talked about how important it was. There's the Rutland people demanding that the highway be sent to the center of the state, 91. But their legislative, their push failed. It was always destined to fail. The federal government never signed off on it. But in order to have the Regional Highway Council back off on their demands to relocate the highway, the governor at the time, Ray Keyser, promised southwestern Vermont that he would have a 12-year plan that would definitely build a 4-lane divided limited access highway from Pound Hall to Burlington. This is Governor number 2 who promised southwestern Vermont a better road. Meanwhile, Route 7 looks like that. It's not a particularly good road, and people in southwestern Vermont look on as people build better highways everywhere else in the state, and as skiing becomes a more important and bigger industry, as Killington was founded in 1956, another Magic Mountain, and Bromley, the traffic on Route 7 grew manifestly worse and worse and worse. People talked about what Malfunction Junction here in Manchester was like, on Fridays afternoons going up and on Sunday nights going down. And it was just you could take 5 hours to get through there. It was horrible. And if recreation, if skiing is going to be the economic salvation of this section of the state, how are you going to do that if you have such incredibly inferior roads? But the conservation ethic was accelerating in Vermont because Vermont's brand, its future, its destiny, its economy is built on being this unspoiled image. In 1963, the Vermont Natural Resources Council was founded. And one of the first things they said was, we need to study the impact of the interstate highways we have. And I don't think the impact is good, not on the environment. And if Vermont destroys its environment, it has nothing going for it. It has no future. It has no appeal to outsiders. Vermont wound up looking just like New Jersey, and people won't want to come. They'll stay where they already are. But the highways got built, and people are happy about them, and the greatest development ever is going to happen. And there were, by the mid-60s, even before the interstate highways were completed, clearly impacts on the state. The number of outsiders coming to Vermont became very noticeable. They had this program called Beckoning Vermont, the state Vermont Development Department, and that was the big slogan, was Beckoning Vermont, the beckoning country. And people began to be like, there's too many people coming. Like, Vermont's a little too beckoning. Too many people are buying land, they're buying old farms and building condos. There's just way too much development, and natives are starting to get elbowed out. But Bob Mitchell at the Rutland Herald and the other people in the Regional Highway Council still felt that Vermont had, that the southwestern part of the state was being ignored and being treated unfairly. Which brings us to Governor Hoff. After doing really nothing for 4 years and infuriating people in this part of the state, in 1965, in December, he went to the Regional Highway Council's annual meeting. And he expected, people expected to go throw rocks at him or whatever, and he was guts. And he said, tell me what you want and I will build the road you want. And they said, we want an interstate highway. We were promised one 10 years ago. And he said, I'll build it for you. Which begins the year of the West Side Story. The 1966 legislative session was basically revolved around nothing more than how you were going to fund an improvement to Route 7. It went on and on and on. And I actually talked on the phone with Steve Terry, who worked for the Rutland Herald at the time, who was later Governor Aikens, Senator Aikens' press secretary. And I was like, I can't untangle the story. Like, was it going to be like a 2-lane highway or a 4-lane interstate type highway? Or are they going to build 2 lanes first and do an rights of way acquisition for another 2 lanes? He said no one had any idea. Everyone was confused. Everyone had their own idea what this highway was going to be. But still, they came up with the funding, and they thought that they had it, and people in Rutland were nervously watching as they worked its way. And it worked its way slowly as the months went on through April, until by March, the Rutland Herald was able to proclaim this in large letters on their front page, as finally the bill passed for a $34 million bond issue that was going to guarantee that they were going to be building construction on Route 7, new Route 7, not fixing up the one that existed, but relocating a new one to the west, to the east. And this is the way that the Rutland Herald played it. I just want you to note that this is the way that the Burlington Free Press played it, which is to say, you can see the second paragraph there on your left, which is to say people in Burlington didn't care. But it obsessed people down here. Meanwhile, the highways are getting built all over the state. People down in the southwestern part are like, when are we going to get our highways? When are we going to get the bypass around Rutland that was promised in the 1966 legislation? And they really were looking into bypass routes, and this was all being taken very seriously. But by mid-1967, it began to appear that maybe these aspirations for a really quick rebuilding of Route 7 was not going to happen anytime soon. And then apparently the story is that Governor Hoff, they had a new highway commissioner, Lawrence Larson, came to him in the summer of 1967 and said, we don't have the money for what you promised. And he didn't tell anyone until people just found out. And it turned out, this is in December of 1967, that the state had nowhere near the money, and none of that, if you can read it, it says, how does a $142 million road construction escalate to a $457 million program in 18 months? Which is a very good question. How do you make a $300 million mistake in a state the size of Vermont? People are like, oh my God, this highway is never going to get built. It was like this mass, people in southwestern Vermont were furious. There was a thing about Governor Hoff was going to give a talk in Bennington, and the Bennington Banner had an editorial that said that he better not show up because people will take old paving stones from broken up Route 7 and throw them at him. I mean, people were really mad. So you can't explain how this horrible thing happened. They did open Route 4 at that point, headed towards the Vermont border from Rutland. But after they had an investigation, they decided what they would do is scale back dramatically and basically build the road as far as East Dorset. And that would be what they would build. Still questions about it, is going to be divided into 4 ways, limited access, all those things. But there was no way they were going to build it as far north as Rutland at that point. In the late 60s, they did build the stretch that goes from Rutland down to Wallingford. And in the mid-1950s, they fixed up the part that goes to Danby and figured that that was good enough as it was and that the state couldn't afford anything better. So that was the aspiration from going from an interstate type highway all the way from Pownell to Burlington. We've cut it back to just 20 miles. This is the sort of way that people in Rutland were starting to feel that people in southwestern Vermont generally, that they were being absolutely misused and ignored and it's at that point, when you talk about 1968, that environmentalism really becomes a big thing. Conservation is the wisest of things. Environmentalism, this is, very generally speaking, but environmentalism is the idea that things need to be left alone, that the systems need to remain intact. And something called the Conservation Society of Southern Vermont was founded in 1968. And it had a number of things it was interested in, various aspects of pollution and the preservation of the environment. But it began to be like, you can't send a highway through the Battenville River. You can't send a highway from Bennington to East Dorset. That's a terrible idea. Of all things in the world, you can't do that. And so the Conservation Society of Southern Vermont began to go again, advocate against that. Now, by that point, 1968 or 9, the impact of the interstate highways was really beginning to be felt. The rush of people coming in at that point. And so weirdly, you would think that this was like on April 1st, it was an April Fool's joke, that Bob Mitchell would publish an editorial saying close the borders, when like the week before and the week after he published an editorial being like, we were promised highways back in 1957, we still want them. I mean, if you're going to build that highway, it's going to build more people to southwestern Vermont, and you're already feeling the impact of too many people coming from outside already. Do you really want that highway? I mean, obviously, people commuting, going to shop or whatever, up and down, also had an issue with this road being dangerous. But the question is becoming, how many people is too many people? And how much development is too much development? And how much are people starting to really hate outsiders? And the difference between 1967 and 1970 is really the sweet spot, as far as I can tell, when the anger towards outsiders began to become really noticeable. It became this really dominant narrative in the state that there's too many people, most of them really wealthy, moving here and forcing natives to not be able to live here anymore. And you get all sorts of discussions. You can see how much of the interstate highway were built by 1970, which is to say large stretches of them had not been built yet, the dotted lines of the parts that aren't built. And already the impact of them is too big. Do we even want to really finish them? And you start to see headlines like this, that Vermont's becoming too expensive because too many rich people are buying second homes or retiring here, and what are we going to do? How come Vermont seems to be completely indifferent to the plight of the people who are born here and is prostrating itself for outsiders? Because, as you can see, outsiders spoil Vermont. So that's a very 1970s sort of thing. And then more people became interested, more groups became interested in stopping the Route 7 that had been designed that had been forecast by the legislature in 1968. The Sierra Club and Robert Babcock was the head of the first environmental board in Vermont and resigned. He started Green Up Day, and he resigned in order to start this thing called Vermont Tomorrow. Their big thing was that Vermont's population could be capped at 500,000 people and no more. And people were very concerned by 1970 about what is the impact of superhighways on the environment. I mean, there was a national discussion, as we were saying, about the impact of highways. I mean, the impact of highways on inner cities, and particularly minorities, was absolutely tragic. Vermont had its own problem, which was, what was it going to do to the environment? Vermont is being ruined, said this woman, by highway construction. And so a lot of this is, what's the biggest threat to Vermont? It comes from out-of-state money that's turning our countryside into housing development for wealthy city dwellers. Like a lot of people began, you would not have seen people talking that way 5 years before. It is really like, by the turn of the early 1970s, this was becoming the dominant narrative in Vermont. There's too many rich people moving here, and we have to do something to prevent them from destroying the very place that they're coming to enjoy. They're coming here looking for community, and the thing that they're looking for, they obliterate themselves. They destroy the very thing that they want. Meanwhile, they build completing highways in every section of the state, and finally, in 1971, the state legislature actually decided what it had done, had the money to build the Route 7, relocated Route 7 that they promised back in 1968. They were going to build the road finally, they had the money, it was going to be great. Except something had happened, which is in 1969, something called the National Environmental Policy Act was passed, and what it demanded was environmental impact statements on any project of a certain size that had received federal funding. Environmental impact statements. Vermont didn't have any at that point. But this movement began, you were talking about Stop Super 7, and this is where the Stop Super 7 comes up in. And yes, the Conservation Society of Southern Vermont employed a Bennington attorney named Harvey Carter. And do you remember him? I'd like to talk to you about him after this. Yes, I've spent a lot of time thinking about Harvey Carter over the last year. And so this became the question, can we stop Route 7? And then other people wrote and say, we desperately need Route 7. This is one of those in a nutshell things where people are talking about, I don't know this person, but I grew up in Arlington my whole life, and I've never heard of this guy, but people from out of state are moving here too quickly, ruining everything. And then this is like sort of summarizes where Vermont is in 1972. Someone says, the new road is going to only benefit those horrible people who are coming up here and buying up all the land and chasing us all away. And then the woman in the bottom corner is like, I can't go shopping. What are we going to do? You know? And you ever heard of Joseph Caracciolo, who was a state representative from Bennington? Yeah.
I remember his vegetable stand.
His vegetable stand, yes, and then he became a real estate agent. Yeah, I really admire him. This is something he's, where were these people years ago when we were fighting the fight for these highways? This is, just so you have a sense, I just want to give you a sense of how this narrative goes. I'll just make this a little bigger, if I can find my cursor. This is like exactly what 1972 is really all about. As you can see, it says at the beginning of the article over there that the people expressing concern about this highway, like Sandy Morris, this is a meeting of the Bennington County Regional Planning Commission, and says the highways receive little publicity and no one really knows where it's going or whether it's really needed. And then the commissioner says, I've hold it. Now wait a second. Bennington County residents have been fighting for the new Route 7 since the 1950s. And then Sandy Morris said, well, I've only been here for a year. I mean, that's the kind of thing that drove people in southwestern Vermont insane back then. Trust me on that one. So, we'll go back. Here you go. So, you'll have to tell me, this is a lot of people, that at this point, like, basically the editorial pages of the Rutland Herald and the Bennington Banner have nothing else in them except this topic. And the people can be stopped, and it goes on and on. There's Harvey Carter. And it's at that point, actually, that Roland Seward formed this organization saying that Act 250, passed in 1970, had gone too far. He called it Common Sense Associates. It was a couple of people, some of them in the skiing industry and some of them in the development industries. And they got strongly behind a pro-development candidate for governor in 1972 named Luther Hackett. And he was running against Tom Salmon. And while that campaign was going on, the big event happened. Now, this is where the legal stuff comes in. I don't want to bore you with it, but there was a judge named James Oakes. And James Oakes, and he issued the injunction in 1972 saying that you couldn't build Route 7, the new Route 7, until you had an environmental impact statement. Okay. The Highway Department went and they wrote an environmental impact statement. They allowed a period for comments to it. Everything appeared to be good. This was what he said, which was, the big question was actually that made the injunction was what was going to be the impact of the highway on the Live wilderness area. And it was going to destroy a beaver pond, and well, that was a bit too much. Will the highway be held up for a cobble or a pond? The answer is yes, it is. But they did allow for the 1 mile and a half of Route 7 coming out of Bennington going north to be built.
Caracciolo called it a 4-lane road to the dump.
To a land, yes, I know. Okay, we'll get there. This was in 1972, if you want to see something that is really like a very mistimed, ill judge. Roland Seward had a bad day, where he went in front of a crowd at a meeting, and he said, what are we saving the environment for? The animals? I mean, some people did point out that humans are animals, and that, yes, that's one of the reasons you might want to save the environment, which really cost Luther Hackett the election. Tom Salmon was elected. They got there in November, they published their environmental impact statement, and now the highway seemed like it was definitely going to get built. People who wanted the highway were overjoyed, and people who didn't want it were aghast. And then this theory came up that actually that 20-mile stretch of Route 7 was part of a grand conspiracy by Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Vermont to build an interstate-type highway from Long Island Sound, from Norwalk, Connecticut, all the way to Burlington. I have found no evidence that that's true, but nevertheless, they sued in court, saying that that was what their plan was going to look like. And I will skip this about Dorset. And so they appealed to James Oakes to halt construction again. And on the basis of the two things, that the environmental impact statement had to be for the whole stretch of Route 7 from Connecticut, from the Long Island Sound to Burlington, and also that highway departments, state highway departments had a conflict of interest. He ordered the injunction continued, which, yes, did it make the legislators in Rutland very happy? I mean, they were infuriated. As you can see, Francis Esposito says that they're obstructionists we should not tolerate for another minute, because the people who are stopping Route 7 are not real Vermonters. They're people who moved here from somewhere else, and they want Vermont to stay exactly the same as it is, because the Vermont that they found is one that benefits rich people and not working class people. And so the injunction was continued in the summer of '73, and as you just pointed out, he says right there in the middle, he fought 11 years for that road, and now, what is it again?
4-lane road to the dump.
It's a 4-lane road to the dump, yes.
That's all the end of it.
Yeah, which is, yes, and so, and then it went to the U.S. Second Court of Appeals, which is in New York City, and they found for the plaintiffs. They said that the injunction should stay in place, and now we're going to the U.S. Supreme Court. And because when the Second U.S. Court of Appeals found in favor of the injunction, that meant that highway building in Connecticut and New York had to cease immediately, but also environmental groups in the Midwest and in the Southwest also began to sue on the basis of that judgment, and highway building all over the country stopped. And so something had to be done, and this is going to the U.S. Supreme Court. I always think about, like, Thurgood Marshall is there on the U.S. Supreme Court, and he's like trying to bring racial justice to America, and then he's presented with this thing that's like, well, little old ladies in Shaftesbury can't go shopping in Pennington, you know, and he's like, I don't care. You have to deal with it anyway. So it had wide implications. And then people complained and argued, and more people moved here, and the environmental liberty became a bigger issue, and a lot of people wanted outsiders to stay out. And it's weird because some of the people who most wanted the highway were the ones who were most angry and hostile towards outsiders. But they wanted a highway. But if you build the highway, more outsiders will come. So it's one of those things about diminishing returns, proving that life is not a zero-sum game. Really, this idea, like, there's too many Vermonters already. Close the borders was a very popular thing. At the time, this was all about how it's becoming too expensive to live in Vermont. So rather than have this court case go to the Supreme Court, Congress could fix this. Congress then had to meet for months and months in order to come up with what was called the Route 7 bill. I mean, this is great. This is 20 miles of road in southwestern Vermont became this big political issue. And, you know, this is very much like your 1970s thing. But anyway, did I skip past where it goes to Congress? Oh, yeah. And then, so the bill moved through Congress. And people in southwestern Vermont were just exhausted by 1975 by this Route 7 bill passing the Senate. It sits there for a while. And then finally in August, the President Ford signed the bill that made it so that highway construction could start all over the United States, and that includes Route 7. Is the story over? No, of course it isn't. And actually then everything gets in, and it goes back to the U.S. Second Court of Appeals, and then they have to have another impact study, and Joseph Caracciolo, after the U.S. Court of Appeals ruled that they could begin construction, said that, you know, I'm elated by the decision, I'm just worried about those environmental obstructionists. But the court battle wasn't over, it went on for another couple years. There was a group called, you remember this, there was a group called Friends of 7 that wanted to see the new relocated road built. And there was a group called Vermonters for a Safe and Sane 7 that wanted to see the existing 7 widened and straightened. And it seemed like this was going to go on forever, and that southwestern Vermont was doomed to this sort of like Kafkaesque nightmare of no solutions ever being done. Until 1978, finally there was no more, Harvey Carter completely ran out of avenues, legal avenues to halt construction. And there's Governor Snelling. And so the highway began to get built, starting in 1978. Still, of course, Bob Mitchell was not happy that the highway department had promised the state, the southwestern Vermont, a lot more than it had gotten. But You know, they were building. When they opened the first section, which went to Arlington, Governor Snelling's speech was really funny. He got up there and there was a band, high school bands and ribbon cutting, and he got up there and he said, "This is stupid. This highway should have been built 20 years ago." People were like, "Why would he say that?" But anyway, then it was continued on up through Manchester, finished in 1982, and still discussion about building a bypass all the way around Rutland. They really thought they would get that. This is just a section that meets Route 7 from where it used to terminate, where Route 4 was. And people in Manchester still think that there's too much development. This is about the Equinox Hotel, which is the thing, is that it's like, Vermont is a very precious resource in itself. And development and progress need to be done very carefully. And there is a right way to do it. And I think that's one of the stories about Route 7, and there are a lot of them, which is that it was a testing ground, a training ground for like, how do you negotiate progress, change, in a way that doesn't destroy the most valuable things about what Vermont is about. 1990, the Manchester bypass opens, and many of you remember that quite vividly. And there was some joy about it at the time. The Rutland bypass never got built, but this is generally where the bottom line about this, which is that Vermont has, from the beginning, always had to prove that life wasn't a zero-sum game, and that you could have freedom, unity, development, and tradition, preservation, progress, and tradition at the same time. And that's really hard. It's really complicated to do that. And particularly if Vermont needs to stay on a small scale, but definitely needs to provide jobs for people, then how do you have what is the sweet spot for the right amount of development? And it's a thing that, like, none of the people who wanted to stop Route 7 wanted to see people die in traffic accidents. And none of the people who wanted a new Route 7 wanted to see Vermont's scenery and environment destroyed. It was always, everyone basically agreed about the same things, which is Vermont's a precious commodity, Vermont's a beautiful place, the Vermont way of life is really important and must be preserved. But where is the exact right spot to find where you can have development and not destroy the most precious things about this wonderful state? And this is the thing, is that, you know, people will move here because they want something special, which is a really strong sense of community. But if too many of those people move here, then they'll destroy the very thing they're searching for. And so Vermont goes on in its never-ending quest to prove that life isn't a zero-sum game. And for me, that's the important thing about the story, about the saga of Route 7 over all these years.